identity matters a lot to people, and therefore you can't exclude groups, and they might be incentivized to undermine the system, perhaps through violence. This is the study of government, politics, and political behavior. The study of politics is study of government and power. We have, for example, coercive power, charisma, reward power, the ability to financially incentivize people. What is the function of an election? There must be a peaceful transfer of power. Is it possible to have unity with diversity, or does it have to tip one way? What motivates people to vote a particular way? Egotropic, you're voting based on your own self-interest. Or how much are you worried not about yourself? That's called sociotropic. It's more altruistic. What are the causes of war, or a country having a civil war? We have this sort of idyllic view of hunter-gatherers. What these empires did is they conquered, but they brought order. Is the nation-state becoming obsolete? Is democracy in retreat? These are all questions that I think are important to people who want to have a better understanding of the times they live in. Right, welcome everybody. My name's Eric Kaufmann. I've been a professor of politics for about 25 years. I'm going to be talking today about political science. This is an introduction to the study of politics, or in the US or in North America, it's called political science more often. Essentially, what politics, the study of politics is, it's a study of two broad things, which is government, which is a sort of a set of institutions, and power, which in a crude way is really about getting people to do things, particularly things they don't otherwise want to do. In more detail, this is the study of government, politics, and political behavior. And that includes a number of different aspects. So this is about understanding political systems, that is the institutions, processes, power processes and dynamics, political ideologies, and also how individuals behave politically. There's two real dimensions there. One is really to do with either government or power. And then the other is to do with the empirical, studying how the world actually works, versus the ought, how we would like to see the world work, which is more the ideology, the political philosophy. The is more studying of political systems and institutions and the behavior of individuals and groups. So that's kind of rough breakdown of what political science is about. And it's often interdisciplinary as a field and draws on insights from economics, history, philosophy, and so on. So that's kind of a real, very quick overview of political science. Just think government on the one hand, power on the other, as being core to what this is about. And I kind of want to use an analogy really from physics, where if you think about energy and matter, E equals mc squared, there's this relationship. If you think of matter, that's something, it feels like something physical, and energy is sort of a flow. And similarly with thinking about political science, we have this energy, which is power, which is kind of flowing through the system. And then you have the matter, which is the institutions, the government, the legislatures, the courts, and so on. So we've got these different aspects, power and government, which you can think about in very crude terms as similar to energy and matter within the system. There's also another physics analogy, which is to the idea of potential energy, which is, water behind a dam, or a ball which is up high and is about to fall down. It's got potential energy. And similarly, when we think about power, why did the US defeat Japan in the Pacific War? We can think of a whole series of sources of power, resources, the number of people in a country, the technological level, the education level, and all of these are resources that can be feeding into political power of an entity like a nation state. So that is another analogy, again, with physics, this idea of the potential power of an entity, which is governed to some degree by its resources. We can also think more broadly about power, about social power. And if we think of various sources of social power, there's, again, an analogy with various sources of energy. So you think about tidal, wind, solar, wave power, biomass, coal, etc. These different sources of energy, and similarly we have different sources of power. It could be that you are an expert and everybody looks to you, and so there you're able to make people do things, or you're able to pay people money, so that's a sort of reward-based power. Or maybe you're a gang leader and you can threaten them with kneecapping or being killed. That's kind of coercive power. So we've got all these different sources of power. Another one is charisma. Charismatic leaders are able to get people to do things more easily than uncharismatic leaders. Resources, the degree to which you can sort of buy what you want. So we have these different sources of social power, which you can kind of analogize as similar to some degree as sources of energy in a physical system. And just to run through a number of these sources of social power, we have, for example, coercive power, which is the ability to, through the use of force and threats, to get people to do what they may not want to do. And so government and law enforcement agencies have this kind of power to enforce laws and maintain order. And just to pick a number of these others, reward power, the ability to obviously financially incentivize people to do what you want them to do. So employers have this kind of power over employees. Although sometimes, obviously, employees may have more of the power if it's very hard to get workers and you have to keep them happy, then they have a certain amount of power. So that's reward power. There is also the idea of legitimate power, power that derives from an institution, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court or CEO. And notice I'm not just talking about governing institutions or political institutions. I'm talking about a business, for example. There could be power in a relationship. There could be power at many different sites in society. We also have informational power. Controlling flows of information can be useful. So, for example, an intelligence agency that has control over certain data that is very valuable. You might be a connector. You might be somebody who everyone needs to get to know because they can put you in touch with somebody who's influential. So that sort of social connector power, someone with extensive networks, particularly influential networks, has that kind of connection power. I mentioned charisma already, a charismatic individual, Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela, these sorts of people who are able to inspire people, and that gets people to do what somebody wants them to do. So that's another source of power. So we have these different sources of power, even interpersonally, even in an organization like a business, not to mention a government. When we think about power as again, I use the analogy of energy in a system. So power is a process, and we need to distinguish the idea of power being able to get people to do what you want them to do, particularly if they don't necessarily want to do it. Power as a process from what we're going to talk about next, which is government and structures, political structures. So there's power, the process, the flow, and then there are political structures. Here are a couple on this slide. The first is the structure of the military, the US military in this case. You have the army, and then beneath that, corps, and then divisions, brigades, battalions, companies, and then down to the platoon and even down to the squad. So you've got that sort of organization chart. And similarly, you have an organization which starts with the generals to the major generals to the colonels, and et cetera. So you have that kind of structure. Also, you have that structure within governing institutions. And that, you might say that it's important to have that structure because that allows for the most efficient exercise of power. If you want to have the most effective military, then you should have this kind of a structure where power flows down from the top, and that allows the machine to move more effectively and efficiently. Now, there are some who would say, well, maybe it's in some cases better to have more power at a lower level so that local commanders can take initiatives. And in some situations, that may be the case. But in other situations, it makes sense to have this more vertical power structure. But the point here is that what we're talking about are structures versus the flow of power within those structures, which is not the same thing. It's important to say that with regard to structures, I've mentioned there's government, political structures. There's also other kinds of structures. There are economic structures. You have businesses within an economy. There are social structures, networks, groups. Political is one of 4 bits of social science, in a way. You've got politics, the economy, the society, and the culture. And I'll show you in a way how these things interrelate. So in terms of structures, we can distinguish the governing institutions and the political structures from social structures, cultural structures, and the economic structures. Another way of thinking about where politics fits into the broader social sciences, and even beyond that, into knowledge as a whole. Where does politics fit and power fit? And I'll draw here on the work of a famous sociologist called Talcott Parsons, who wrote a book called The Social System in 1951. You know, if you think of our society, you've got individuals who speak a certain language and have certain meaning system. That's the cultural level. They have certain social networks, friends, groups they're members of, associations. That's the social level. Then you have power and how power is managed, the structures that manage power. That's the political level, which is what we're mostly going to be talking about on this course. You then have beneath the political, in a way, the economic level, which is how to acquire resources, distribute resources, produce resources. That's the economic level. And then we have, you know, if you think of us as individuals, we're cultural beings, we're social beings, we're political beings, we're economic beings, we're obviously biological. You know, we have heart, lungs, etc., cells. But that biology then relies on the chemical layer, about what we put into our bodies, and then the physical, the physics, neutrons and everything that's just underneath that. So you kind of have this emergent properties. You go from the physical level to the chemical to the biological, and then above that into the social. You've got economy, politics, and culture. And a way of thinking about this is that as we move up from the physical through to the biological, up into the social, the information is going up and the matter and energy is going down. So economy is more, you're very close to the ground, digging up resources, redistributing. It's the material, and to some degree, the lower level survival needs of a population. The cultural is more once you've satisfied those needs. It has higher informational content, lower matter energy. This was sort of the theory of Parsons, but and what his argument was is that each of these levels had a certain function to play, had its part to play in the way society works. And so if we think about that, then political has a certain function in society. That is, how do you harness power, organize power, distribute power most effectively in a society? And that's the job of the political layer. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. But obviously the political layer interacts with the social and the economic and the cultural, and even the physical layers as well. So we've got institutions, i.e. as structures, and politics as power. Just looking at this question of power, you know, you can analyze power as an aspect not just of government, but as an aspect of many other kinds of structure. So we can see it at work in social groups, in the economy, in a business, and not just in government institutions. And so if we think about the work of particularly feminists and Marxists, but particularly feminists, for example, this idea that power is everywhere, and, you know, so in a relationship between a man and a woman, there's various power balances. You can have power structures that are encoded even in social relationships. So that view that power is something that can be abstracted away from just the political structures, and we can see it operating in many different parts of society, is really a view that says, well, politics is about power. And you can almost imagine a kind of grid which has the sort of four structures of society, the economy, the polity, the society and the culture, and the four flows, the sort of processes or functions, which is economic production and distribution, political effectiveness and stability or power, community cohesion, which is really about social ties and networks, and then the last is the cultural level, which is about meanings. We're actually going to look mainly at political structures in this course, but you could equally look at power and focus only on power. Now, that's not mainly what political science does, but you could look at just the study of power in businesses and firms, in the economy, or in relationships, or in the meaning-making cultural system. So you may or may not have heard of Michel Foucault and postmodernism, who, you know, these sorts of ideas where they say that knowledge is power, and that, in fact, all knowledge encodes certain power relationships, and there's always power machinations that are driving whether certain words are used, certain sentences, certain myths and narratives are used. So that's a sort of very political approach to culture. So we can have a political, power-centered approach to culture, society, and the economy, as well as to the polity. And the polity is just another word for the political institutions of a society. So within that set of political institutions, we can also look at the impact. We can look at the impact of the economy on the political structure. So we can look at how economic forces affect, shape government at all levels. We can look at how social forces and networks and groups affect politics and elections and parties and all these different political institutions. And then also we can look at cultural battles, religious fundamentalism, nationalism, cultural left ideology. How do the culture wars, how do all these things affect parties and power and elections? And so those are all different ways in which we can look at the way that these structures and these processes interact. Now, alongside just sticking with this analysis of a 4x4, the structures and the processes, there are different fields within political science and also economics and sociology, which tend to take each of these grids as their focus of analysis. So, for example, political economy is the branch of politics that would look at the interplay between power in the economy and between political structures and economic structures. So the IMF and World Bank as structures that might affect national politics. The idea there is that in a way, political structures are shot through by economic forces and vice versa as well. I mentioned just now Foucault and postmodernism, people who study culture who are saying, well, actually, we have to study the impact of power on culture. That would be an example of where the cultural structure being affected by the political as a force, as a process. And this kind of gets to, there's a slide here from the Andrew Haywood textbook, which tries to understand, well, what is politics? And tries to say, well, we have two definitions. One is the art of government and public affairs, and that's very much the institutional definition of politics. The other is this idea of power, and politics is a process, and there the focus is more on this idea of how is it that we're not just tearing each other's throats out? How is it that people are able actually to organize, determine who has power and when, and that can therefore be very functional and efficient for the running of a system. So we have a constitution that says, well, in this situation, the Supreme Court has power. In this situation, the House of Representatives and the Senate has power. Or in this situation, the President has power. Those are all ways of determining who has power when in order to achieve consensus and agreement rather than conflict. So part of the idea of political institutions is these are ways of managing conflict and competing interests in order to make the society function better. So we have then this debate over what is politics. Is it more about the institutions or is it more about power as a process? You also have different theories. So for example, and you won't be familiar with these names, but behavioralism, rational choice theory, institutionalism, these are names given to empirical political science theories. That is, theories that try to explain the world as it is, and they explain the functioning of parties and governments and individuals within the system. But they are different theories that would put an emphasis. So for example, institutionalism puts more emphasis on institutional rules and people obeying those rules, and they're the institution reproducing itself over time through long stretches of time. Whereas rational choice theory is much more about, no, there's just this collection of individuals. Forget about institutions. It's just all these individuals seeking their best interests, and where those interests align, you suddenly have a movement. Very individualistic approach versus the institutional approach, which is much more of a group structure. Those are just different theories within political science about how the world works. They are a bit more institutional or focus more on explaining what's happening in institutions, whereas feminism and particularly postmodernism would tend to be looking not just at government and parties and political institutions, but also at relationships, culture, and other realms. So they're more interested in politics as power, as a process, not politics as institutions. A distinction as well, which we can think about between the public and the private, and traditionally the idea of political science is about the public realm, the public sphere, not the private realm. And this was the division. The family would be off limits not off limits, but it's just not of interest to political science, because the view was that's not really where politics takes place. Politics might take place in a town hall meeting, maybe. It could be local politics. It could be a council meeting. It could be parliament. It could be something that's larger, but essentially there's this distinction between the private and the public. That is to some degree challenged by increasingly newer views that would argue that politics takes place across the public-private boundary. There's the view of politics then as public affairs, which is the traditional view, which would distinguish between the political, which is, again, the town hall meetings and the government and what's happening in the public, which is reported on by the press, and then the non-political, which is the private sphere of the family, but even associational life, people meeting, forming clubs, for example, friendly societies, that would be seen as not politics. That's civil society, and that's outside politics, at least in this traditional view that distinguishes between the public and private realm. There's clearly a disagreement between some who think that more of the so-called private realm is actually properly studied as political science. So civil society associations, for example, fraternities like the Masons, for example, or some of these associational bodies actually are quite political. They lobby, they get involved in trying to raise money for different causes. So the line between the public and private is actually pretty blurry according to this views. And especially when we're talking about businesses and trade unions and other groups, which may even have formal representation. The trade unions have a formal representation in the Labour Party, for example, in Britain. If we take Northern Ireland, Protestant fraternities like the Orange Order long had they had a certain number of seats within the Unionist Party. So there actually can be some quite formal ties between these so-called private civil society organizations and formal politics, and therefore it doesn't necessarily make sense to split the public and the private so neatly. And then, as I mentioned, the more radical postmodernist Foucauldian type arguments are that, or feminist arguments would say, well, actually, even in the very private family relationships, you've got power going on, and that's part of politics. And so that's even more, taking this view even more radically, that there really is almost nothing that is private and not part of politics. It's everywhere. You can't really even have any separation. I mentioned the idea of politics as compromise, as a means of resolving conflict that doesn't involve force. And so I mentioned that a constitution, which would stipulate, who has power when, who gets to exercise power. That's very important. As long as everybody buys into this system, that's a way of having legitimate power within a system, so certain individuals and institutions are allowed to get people to do what they want them to do, and that prevents the society from tearing each other apart through old-fashioned forms of politics, which might have involved violence. So this is a means of resolving conflict. If you don't have these institutions, then what you have is anarchy, and what you have is violence. And actually, anarchy historically has been associated with very high levels of violence and very high levels of death and disorder in a society. So actually, the historical record and social science really does tell us that anarchy is really a terrible way of organizing society, and it leads to poverty and violence. So you need to have social order, something that people are content to accept in order to have a high-functioning society. Some of this text from the Andrew Haywood reader, which I'm drawing on to some degree in this lecture, would argue that we are maybe moving into a period in which there is weaker legitimation in the system, so that people are not as willing to accept the authority of the existing party system, the existing government structures. And so you have the rise of, for example, populism and polarization. One of the arguments is, does that represent a breakdown in the political order, people's willingness to accept certain rules, who has power, and how conflicts are resolved? If there's a loss of faith in the political class, in the political institutions, if that legitimacy is withdrawn, do we then revert to earlier and more anarchic forms of human relations? And that's one of the questions we might want to ask, is to what extent is that really happening? Or is that, in fact, is this just part of the normal warp and weft of politics. I mean, because the counter view would be to say that actually populism is important also in a political system in terms of allowing voices that have been excluded to enter the system and have representation. And so this is actually part of the normal working of democracy. Against that are those who say, well, no, populism represents actually the loss of faith in the procedures and rules in the system, and therefore threatens the system and threatens to lead to a breakdown in the political order. In terms of political analysis, the way political scientists do politics, there are different levels here. We have, for example, concepts such as conservatism, liberalism. We have models, which are ways of explaining particular problems in the world at a relatively low level. You know, why do people vote for party A instead of party B? Is it to do with the economy going up or down? Is it to do with certain social groups shifting their votes from one party to the other? So you have these sorts of lower level models explaining particular phenomena. And then you have, finally, at the greatest level of abstraction, you have theories like Marxism, Marxism explains the world as largely emanating from what's happening in the economy. And so if the economy is organized through feudalism, then you get one kind of political order. If it's organized through capitalism, then you get another kind of political order rising automatically up from the means of production. One of the most important is this distinction between pluralism and elitism. The pluralist view is that politics is about a bunch of different interests that are competing with each other to advance their own particular interests, and they make deals and compromises in order to form coalitions to get ahead. Another view, however, is no, all of that activity of these different groups pursuing interests is much less important than what's going on with a particular elite who control the top tiers in those political structures, and that is really what drives change within the system. So elite theory versus more pluralist approaches. And then you also have an earlier tradition, which is no longer talked about as much, which is functionalism, which is all about saying, well, what is functionally necessary? What is good for? What is good for a particular society in terms of organizing power, in terms of culture, and so on. And whatever is good for society is what's going to emerge. So it may be good for the society to have a more hierarchical political system, or perhaps a more decentralized political system. And that's the functionalist view. So it's a certain set of theories compared to the pluralist and the elite theories. In terms of political science is often focused, well, much of politics is focused on the domestic level, looking at politics within a society, parties, interest groups, governing structures. But there is also an international and global dimension to politics as well. That is, you have political institutions at many different levels. You've got your local government, you've got your regional, state, etc. governments, you have your national governments, but you also have supranational, above the nation, levels of government, such as the European Union, or even global, like the UN, IMF, World Bank, these other institutions which are above the level of the nation state. You also have global flows, which are maybe not to do with global institutions, but you have, for example, multinational corporations which have operations across borders and have a lot of power, perhaps, over certain governments. If they say, well, we'll build a factory here, which will generate this many jobs and will pay you a certain amount, then they get a certain amount of power over a particular country. You may have transnational lobby groups. Friends of the Earth operates in many different countries, can lobby the United Nations, can lobby particular governments at the nation state level, or transnational terrorist organizations. That could be Al-Qaeda, it could be ISIS, it could be, a transnational terrorist group, transnational criminal groups. So these different organizations and processes which cut across political boundaries and to some extent have been accelerated by greater connectivity between countries in the world through the internet, perhaps through cheaper air travel, the ability of finance capital to move around the world more easily. All of these forces of globalization means there's perhaps more interpenetration between the global level or even the supranational level and the nation state. So this question of how do we divide the domestic from the international or global is another question that politics deals with. And one argument is that as we've had increases in global connectivity, to some degree global migration, global trade, that has meant that this distinction between the purely domestic and the international is harder to maintain. And so we have to also look at politics internationally and globally and not just nationally. It's worth saying, however, there is a branch of politics called international relations. And international relations very much looks at the way nation states interact with the global, whether that's defined as supranational organizations like the IMF, World Bank, and UN and European Union, or the sort of global flows, transnational flows. I mentioned crime, terrorism, international civil society lobby groups, for example. Just ways in which the political interacts with that. International relations is also very interested in the relationship between states in the world. If you think about the fact that within a particular country, the country has a monopoly on the use of force. I mean, that's the definition of the state classically, is this idea that the state has a monopoly on the use of force inside the territory and defense of the country against those outside. So the policing and the military, you can't have separate power jurisdictions within a particular state and call it anything other than a weak state or a failed state. If Afghanistan, which has occurred in the past, has had different areas that were controlled by different warlords, the argument therefore is that that's a weak state or a failed or fragile state. Whereas it's only when you have the government, as in Britain, that would control the entire country politically, so orders from the center would run through the entire country. There you have actually got strong state capacity throughout the territory. But if you think about the international, you have almost 200 different nation states in the world. And it's not obvious that those 200 nation states are under any kind of authority, whereas the different regions of the United States or France are under the control of the American or French authorities. Whereas the relationship between countries in the world and the global level is one of anarchy. It's more like Afghanistan in the sense during the warlord period where you have different areas controlled by different people. And that's really the world. There's 200 different warlords, if you like, in the world, controlling each of those states. There is no central authority, nobody centrally who can tell countries what to do. Now, that's not to say there is zero influence at the global level or at the supranational level, particularly if countries have signed up to be members of a supranational entity like the European Union. They will have strong incentives to abide by European directives. And there is perhaps some global civil society and global influence of global institutions like the United Nations. These are things that international relations scholars would tend to focus more on. And they would also focus on how states relate to each other in that anarchy. Again, thinking of 200 different warlords, how do states manage relationships with the other warlords in that global ecosystem? And that's a different question. It involves many things: strategy, military strategy, alliance behavior, whether you decide to join supranational organizations or not. All of those questions are the questions of international relations. I won't be talking too much about international relations per se in this course. That's probably a separate course, has separate theories about how states behave in the global order and the influence of supranational and global institutions. So just to kind of walk you through a number of different subfields within political science, we have the study of government and institutions, which is the structures and functions of government, different levels, which we'll be talking about in a subsequent lecture: legislators, executives, judiciaries, electoral systems, party systems, and bureaucracies. That's kind of the classical domestic politics or comparative politics field. We then have political behavior, which is analyzing the behavior of the individuals and groups within a system. How do they behave? Do they behave rationally? Do they behave tribally? Do they obey elites? You know, what are the ways in which actors within the system behave? Again, government and institutions, political behavior, those are both about how the political world works is the empirical. Political theory is about the ought. So the first two are more like science. Political theory is more like philosophy. How, if we could design things perfectly, what is the way in which we should organize power and society? So questions about justice, authority, rights, the role of government within the system. Should we, there are political theorists who believe in pretty much an anarchy, that, if you just let people be and you get government off their backs, you will have this spontaneous brotherly order that will emerge. That is one political philosophy. Another is, no, actually people aren't angels. You need to actually have a system that can moderate their excesses, and that's a different political theory. It's very close. Political theory is very much like political philosophy, going back to Aristotle and Plato, and it has a much older lineage. So political philosophy and political theory are pretty much the same thing. Liberalism, socialism, conservatism, these are all political philosophies. There are also other kinds of distinctions between, for example, those who think you can judge a system by the consequences of a particular system, so what's called consequentialism, and those who say no, that there are first principles you have to stick to, which is known as deontology or deontological political philosophy. So that's political theory. It's much more about how ought we to organize society and politics. And that's different from the other parts of political science, which are largely about, let's just study, why do people vote the way they do? Why do certain political systems lead to more coups, more war? Those are actually scientific questions that have a right and wrong answer in a way. We then also have comparative politics, which is really about, well, what can we learn about different domestic politics by comparing processes in different countries? Let's look at populism across, not just in the United States, with Trump, let's say, or Bernie Sanders, but we're going to compare that to what's happening in Britain with maybe Farage and Jeremy Corbyn, or we're going to go to Europe and look at Syriza, and we're going to Podemos, and we're going to look at other, the populist right in Europe, or perhaps we're going to go globally, and we're going to look at Modi in India and Milei in Argentina, and we're going to take a global view, and maybe by zooming out and looking at larger groups of countries, we can start to see patterns and relationships that hold globally, but then maybe certain patterns only hold, let's say, in the West. Maybe populism in the West is more about immigration, and maybe populism in the developing world is more about governments that are not delivering economically. That could be true, it could not be true. Maybe there are certain similarities, but comparative politics is really about looking at political units across the globe and trying to find patterns cross-culturally. Another one might be, what are the factors that predict a country going to war? Or a country having a civil war. We can take 200 countries across 50 years and look at what correlates with what. One of the things might be that countries that are poorer are more likely to have civil war. That's one of the findings in the literature. So comparative politics is again another field, tends to take the nation state as its unit of analysis and have a very international kind of focus. I mentioned international relations already. I'm not going to go into more detail about international relations. Some of the topics that you might study if you take IR are diplomacy, conflict, international law, and global governance. The reason international law, now you see, with international law, you have politics shading over into law as a field. And the reason for that is that these international law codes, if a country is if there's genocide going on in a country, should the outside world step in? In Rwanda, should the US have invaded Rwanda to prevent the genocide? There's a couple of principles at work in international law. One is, well, we have to respect state sovereignty, the right of Rwanda. Rwanda has power within Rwanda, and if we every time there's problems in a country, we allow outside powers to come in and invade a country, we're breaching state sovereignty. So one view is state sovereignty has to be the highest principle. Another view is, no, it's human rights, it's the highest principle, the rights of the individual. So if the human rights are being violated in a country, then other countries have the right to invade to restore human rights. So these are different principles. They're balanced in different ways within international law. And in a way, international law is a bit like constitutions within countries, but at a global level. So in a country, you would say who has power within the country, you know, the courts, the legislatures, the president. But in international law, it's about which principle is supreme. Generally speaking, in international law, state sovereignty is the highest principle. It's higher than human rights, actually, generally speaking. So that's international relations. We then have political economy, which I've mentioned about. This is the intersection between political and economic institutions, analyzing how political institutions affect the economy. So one famous book talks about how if you have very authoritarian government, then you tend to get corruption. You don't tend to get a lot of trust. Property rights are not very secure, and therefore it's very hard for the economy to grow. So if you have a sort of authoritarian or an anarchic political system, then that's going to have a very negative impact on the economics. It's going to be very hard to get, particularly a free market emerging, where people have secure property rights, where if someone cheats you, you can go to the courts. All of that is very difficult when you don't have the right political institutions in place. So this is really exploring the connection between political institutions and the economy. Another subfield is public policy, which is, the question is, how is policy influenced? You know, who sets the direction of economic policy in a country? Is it lobby groups? Is it the bureaucrats in the civil service? What is the role of executives, etc.? The media. So there are all these different forces that would affect policy and whether certain policies are enacted. It could well be that the population as a whole wants a certain policy. Maybe they want more spending on the health service. Maybe they want lower taxes. But that's not what comes out formally because there are different interests. Maybe lobby groups perhaps have more power than the average citizen, and so what turns out in the end, or maybe the civil service or the bureaucracy actually is able to frustrate certain policies and is able to have influence in shaping the direction of policy. So there are all these different actors. It's not just the people having their preferences enacted. There are actors within the system at the elite level, also at the bureaucratic level, that might be able to steer policies in a certain way, which may systematically be different from what the population wants. And so then you get discontent rising in the system. One of the reasons for populism might be, so for example, in Western countries, one argument is that immigration is higher than what most citizens want for a whole bunch of reasons to do with lobby groups within the system, the preferences of certain elites within the system, and therefore there's a sort of dissonance between what the population wants and what the government is delivering, and that's creating discontent within the system that leads to more populism. That's one argument. And then finally, we come to research methods isn't really a proper field of politics. It's more just a way of how do you study? How would you study the political? There are many different methods. There's case study methods where you look at different countries, let's say, or, you know, business where you look at a company. You know, that's more like a case study approach, business studies. Whereas a lot of comparative politics now would tend to use large-scale quantitative data sets. So 200 countries over 50 years along 10 different characteristics like rich or poor, are they a democracy or not, how big is their population, were they colonized, how many ethnic groups in the country. All of these things are thrown into the model, and you see which are the factors that predict a country going to civil war or becoming a democracy. And that's sort of a quantitative modeling approach, which is probably, at least in the top journals in political science, that tends to be the approach. Now, if you're doing political philosophy or but political philosophy to a large extent, then you would not use quantitative methods because it's all about the ought. So you're engaging in philosophical reasoning and arguing about pros and cons, first principles, premises, and so forth. So just to conclude then, I've tried to give you a very, very broad overview of what is politics. We've talked about politics as institutions of government and politics as power, the processes and functions of the power flowing through the institutions. We then turn to look a little bit at models and different subfields within politics, such as I talked about comparative politics, international relations, and political theory or political philosophy. Those are the three big branches of political science. And again, just to sort of reiterate, there is this distinction between the empirical, the study of political behavior and institutions, that very scientific approach, which you can do through different methodologies. You can use case studies, you can use large-scale quantitative modeling, or that's the is part, which is most of political science, but then we have the ought, how ought we to design society and politics, and that's more the political theory. Again, those are sort of two separate foci. And again, to reiterate, there's also that difference between power as process and government as institutions. So between those two, that kind of gives you a very sort of quick, high-level view of the field. And there are different theories and subfields that would tend to focus on different combinations of those two processes.